Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for appearing. Can you hear me and see me?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you. My question, I've got two main questions, and I'd like brief answers possible, please. Thank you for your submissions. Thank you for the way you're answering questions right now, very clear and precise. My first question, the government says that it can't trust social media platforms, and I agree with them. It says we need transparency, and I agree with them. Then it says we're going to hand the power to censor people and to assess comments to the social media platforms. Does that make sense to you?
Well, Senator, that's actually just the current state of affairs. That's what happens right now, is that the platforms are making these decisions. We have no way of knowing what parameters they're using, who is making these decisions. And if you look at the Digital Services Act Transparency Database, which actually lists per day the thousands upon thousands of actions that platforms are taken on various types of content, you'll see that these transparency measures, when they are implemented, do work to have some oversight. But at the moment, we have no way of knowing what the platforms are doing, and it's really important to note that the platforms make an unbelievable amount of money from mis and disinformation and indeed just inflammatory content that is beyond the scope of this, and noting that it is subjective. But they do make a lot of money from it because it is engaging content. It drives engagement, which drives their profits. So I do agree that we should not be trusting the platforms because they do not have a commercial imperative to do anything meaningful about the problem. But at the moment, we have no idea how they're making these decisions, and they're making these decisions every day, all the time, the livelong day, often by machines.
We're asking the peddlers of misinformation to control misinformation. So, Victorian Bar?
One of our concerns about the drafting of the bill, which speaks to a similar concern, is that the definition of misinformation complaint presupposes that people only complain about things being misinformation, whereas one of our concerns is precisely because the power of censorship does indeed lie in the hands of platform operators, that it's entirely possible for them wrongly to label, perhaps for an ideological reason, content as being misinformation and disinformation and therefore de-incentivising it or the like. And therefore it occurred to us that insofar as the bill quite rightly aims to increase transparency and things of that sort, one thing it doesn't do is provide any obvious redress for people whose content is wrongly labelled as being misinformation.
Thank you. Ms Toomey?
Yeah, well, look, I don't trust the platforms either in relation to this for obvious reasons, but one of the points of this legislation is to try and get codes so that we've got some kind of a basis of, some guidelines and rules around what they do. So from that point of view, the bill is actually supposed to be improving the current process. So if it can improve transparency and if it can put sensible codes and guidelines around what they do, then that's sort of better than what happens at the moment. But the reality is, this is their platforms. They're outside Australia. They run these things. They can choose what they put on and what they don't. We have pretty limited powers in relation to that, so we're pressing up against the edges of them. If we can improve that, that's a good thing. But as a general principle, outsourcing censorship to foreign corporations generally, no, not a good idea.
Thank you. I was going to ask a question about the need for transparency around their algorithms and how they censor people already, how they limit expression. But I asked that last week, and Senator Pocock's already asked you, so I'll honour that process. But the second question I have now is, who is the arbiter of truth in this bill? Who is the arbiter of truth?
Well, that's the peculiar thing. So if you look at the bill, when it talks about, what's reasonably verifiable as false, how do you decide? Well, at first instance, it's the digital platforms that decide. How on earth would they know? Particularly given the squillions of posts that are made, and then making those really fine assessments about what is serious harm in Australia to our economy, etc., etc. Not a hope that anyone in America knows any of that stuff. So if you look at the bill, then they just seem to rely on fact checkers. And so they partner with fact checkers, and it's fact checkers who decide these sorts of things, what's true and what's not. How do they decide? Because they don't have a clue either. And this is one point I really do want to stress. They then ask experts. Now, I've been on the expert side of this. I've been asked for many fact checks, right? And here's my experience of it. The people that I'm dealing with are, they try hard and they're well-meaning, but they are not experts themselves in the field. They'll ask me a question in a particular form of words. I'll give them an answer that's suited to the way they ask me that question. And then sometimes later on, I read what they write and discover that they have misinterpreted it or themselves been misleading about it because they thought the sort of words that they used for me when they asked me the question actually mean the same as another set of words which mean something quite different, okay? So the problem with expertise is the expert might have it, but the person writing the fact check doesn't. And they often misunderstand the experts, so they often get it wrong. In the old days, they used to come back to the expert and say, well, this is what I've written, is it right? And he'd just say, oh, no, you've misunderstood this, you need to change those words, whatever. They don't do that anymore. And the impression I get is that these are just, frequently young kids out of university who don't really know. And they're taking on this really important role of making a decision that will lead some Meta or Google or whatever to make decisions about what is true and what is false, when the fact checker themselves hasn't properly understood what the experts have said. And it's also really dependent on what experts you choose. How many are out there who actually answer your email and say, quick, I need this response in 24 hours? You can get quite distorted fact-checking reports as a consequence. So the process of working out what is reasonably verifiable is not a very good one, I'm afraid.
Victorian Bar.
Senator, this is the gaping hole at the heart of the bill. I mean, it's the catchphrase is jesting pilot asked what is truth but would not stay for an answer. The whole point is that for it to be shown that any content is misinformation or disinformation, the true position has to be identified. But the bill, other than the surmise that the platform does it, and if the platform doesn't do a good enough job, the ACMA will do it, it seems to be simply a statutory supposition that the truth will be discerned by that process. But the bill doesn't say so. There's a gap on the critical question about how the truth against which misinformation and disinformation is to be identified is to be set out. The bill just doesn't tell us.
Thank you. Human Rights Law Centre.
And, what I would say is that this is probably the reason why we actually need legislation or at least regulation of these platforms in a much broader way that imposes a legislated duty of care over them, because that would give you transparency over how their algorithms are working, not necessarily the algorithm itself, but the impacts that they have, because the algorithms themselves do cause harm or they do limit free speech. I know that many people, even just sort of around the table and their representatives, they complain that the platforms are already making these decisions, because they are, and we have no way of seeing what impact these decisions have. A legislated duty of care would be a much better way of proceeding, but than what we have at the moment, noting that what we have at the moment relies a lot on platform self-regulation, at least at first instance. Having that sort of systemic view of the problem might actually get us out of these conversations about the veracity of content or otherwise, and actually focus regulatory efforts on the platforms, and indeed have the platforms carry the burden of the regulatory efforts, because they're the ones who are going to have to foot the bill at the end of the day. So we do think that as an upstream consideration of the broader problem is best, because of what the kind of ecosystem that we're building online. Because it's not just mis and disinformation, there's a whole lot of other harms perpetuated online that are not mis and disinformation but are causing real harm to real people.
I'd like to ask one
Senator
brief question.
Roberts, I am going to have to rotate
Bar.
the call. There's an awful lot of senators in the room looking to ask questions.
Thank you, Chair.